All right, here we go. So hello, I am Susan Spica. I am the Executive Director of Education Voters of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us tonight for this short presentation and webinar about special education funding and charter schools and cyber charter school wasteful spending on advertising. So we're going to start off by looking at a report that EdVoters recently issued. It's an update for a report we did a couple of years ago called Fixing the Flaws in Pennsylvania's Special Education Funding System for Charter Schools, How an Outdated Law Wastes Public Money, Encourages Gaming the System, and Limits School Choice. So if you don't know EdVoters, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is a project of the Keystone Research Center. And our mission is to ensure that elected officials adopt and implement a pro-public education agenda. We are very focused on ensuring that students have the resources they need in their classrooms to succeed, and also that want to make sure that tax dollars that are being spent on education are being spent in an effective way educating children. So we're going to just start here with a little overview of how special education funding works in Pennsylvania. So we have two different funding systems for special education, one system for school districts and one system for charter schools. So for school districts, the special education funding that they receive from the state is based on the special education funding formula that differentiates students into three cost tiers according to their level of educational need. For charter schools, funding is based on what we call one-size-fits-all calculation that assumes that 16% of each school district's students receive special education services. So in 2014, the Special Education Funding Commission came up with the formula that bases state funding on the tiered levels of need, and they recommended that this formula be applied to charter schools and to school districts because they are both public schools. Unfortunately, what happened was that charter schools were able to lobby and get themselves exempt from the special education funding formula that was implemented in 2015. So what we look at in this report is this problem, and critics of this one-size-fits-all charter school special education funding formula argue that it creates incentives for charter schools to enroll students whose services cost less than the per student tuition they receive from districts, and to deny access to students whose disability requires greater intervention and higher cost. So that's kind of the question that we're going to be looking at in this report. So I just want to do a little deeper dive into the special education funding formula. So prior to 2015, special education from the state was funded not like this. So the legislature recognized, and a bipartisan commission recognized, that we needed, with the limited special education dollars that we have, to direct them to school districts so that the funding would match the cost of, as closely as possible, the cost of this providing students with disabilities with the services that they need. So it recognizes, it categorizes special education into three categories or tiers. But you can see the third tier is kind of divided into effectively two different tiers, 3A and 3B. Each special education tier is defined by the additional costs per student of providing special education services. And so these provide a general sense of how many times more expensive each tier is relative to general education. The first tier, tier 1, is about 90% of students who receive special education services. Tier 2 is about 7% of students, and tier 3A and 3B combined are about 3% of students. And so each tier has a multiplier in the funding formula, so that you can see that for a tier 1 student, the assumption is that it would cost about 1.5 times what it would cost to educate a regular education student. For tier 2, it's about 3.7 times as much. And for tier 3, it is about 7.4 times as much. And you can see the cost categories below. So what are some examples of students who are in these tiers, so we can kind of wrap our heads around it? Students in tier 1, the 90% of students who receive special education are students who need minimal interventions, including something like a weekly speech therapy session, maybe like a little tiny bit of like occupational therapy. Tier 2 students are students who need more significant interventions. So they might need one-on-one help during the school day. They might need to be in a self-contained classroom. They might need more extensive physical or occupational therapy. And then Tier 3 students require the most costly and extensive interventions. Remember, that's about 3% of students. So they might need a full-time nurse or a specialized out-of-district placement. So we're going to talk more about this, how the special education funding formula for charters works. So under the current law, special education funding for charter schools has no relationship with the actual cost of educating and providing services to students with disabilities. So we can see here a child in a district school, if that actual cost for providing that student services is $15,000, the school district pays for the services within its system, and it costs taxpayers $15,000. So it's just whatever it costs is what school districts pay. For charter schools, though, they get the lump sum payment from a school district. So they would enroll a student who is a special education student. Same student costs $15,000 to provide their services, but the charter school gets a tuition payment from a school district that is from $15,000 to $48,000, and now up into the mid $50,000 range, which is what some school districts pay for every single student who goes to a charter school. So you can see that when we have this one-size-fits-all calculation for charter schools, students whose services cost less than the tuition rate, they're a financial gain for the charter school. Students whose services exceed the tuition rate, they are a financial loss. And here's just another example of how charter schools are overpaid for the cost of educating students who require fewer services. And then the flip side is they are underpaid for the cost of students who need more services. So we have student A who needs a half an hour a week of speech therapy. Same student costs $15,000 to provide these services. The payment to the charter school from the school district is $27,000. The charter school then reaps a profit off of that student's tuition payment of $12,000. That $12,000 in special education funding can be spent on anything else. It just goes into their pot of money to spend however they'd like. Now, if we have a student who has a disability that requires more services, like a full-time aide, the actual cost of providing services to that student could be $35,000. The payment to the charter school is still only $27,000. So there just isn't enough money in the tuition payment to cover the cost of providing the services to that student. So we're going to just take a minute and look at how do we get to this one-size-fits-all calculation that has nothing to do with the actual cost of providing kids in charter schools with their services. This is in the charter school law that was written over 25 years ago that has not been touched since then. So what you do is you take the school district budgeted total special education expenditures. So all of those get added up this amount is deducted from their regular tuition. And so that you've just got this pot of money. Then you divide it by the school district average daily membership, which is the number of students in the school district. And that number is multiplied by 16%. So there is an assumption that 16% of the students in each school are receiving special education services. So you do that calculation, and that is your special education portion of the charter school tuition. That special education portion is then added to the regular education tuition rate, and that is how you get your special education charter school tuition rate. Now, I just want to talk about that 16% in there, because there are kind of two different problems with the way that we fund charter school special education. One is that it's just this lump sum payment with no relation to the kids' actual needs. Two, we have the 16% calculation. And so, in dividing the special education spending by 16% of the average daily membership, the formula assumes that the portion of students is 16%. If districts have a larger percentage of students who are receiving services for disabilities, their total spending is spread across more students. So their per student spending for students who are actually receiving services in the district is actually less than the formula assumes. So the special education portion of the tuition they pay to charter schools is inflated. And so special education students in charter schools get actually a larger share of funding than the students who remain in school districts when a school district has more than 16% of their students receiving services. And the last time that I saw this calculated really accurately, there were already over 400 school districts that had over 16% of their students receiving services for disabilities. So I just want to actually show some math about what that looks like in terms of dollars. So we have a school district here, fictitious, called the Deer Run School District. School district has an average daily membership of 4,853 students. So it's just a school district that has 4,800 students. The district has 965 students who receive special education services. So that's close to 20% of their students receive special education services. And their special education spending, their overall special education spending is $14 million. So let's look at the cost let's look at the math. So when we use the actual percentage of students in the school district, which is close to 20%, and we divide the amount of money that is spent on special education, the $14 million divided by the 965 students, we get an average amount per student who has a disability of $14,733 per student. So if every student with a disability got the same amount of funding, they would all get $14,000 in the school district. Now, with this tuition calculation in the charter school law that says, no, you don't get to use your actual percentage of students, we're going to make you use 16%. When you divide that $14 million by 16% of the average daily membership, which is a smaller number, you come out to an average amount per student of $18,000 per student. So you can see that in this district, which would be a typical school district, the district is paying $3,500 more in special education funding for each charter school student than it has to spend on the students that remain in the district, simply because of this arbitrary 16% calculation in the special education formula. So that's the background. And now I would just like to share with you kind of the meat of our report. And if you go to our website, we have the spreadsheets that have the data that we received from the Pennsylvania Department of Education, because we said we need to see if there is an unbiased system, and if charter schools are serving the same exact students as school districts, then we would expect to see that we have equal proportions of students in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 in our school districts, in our brick and mortar charter schools, and in our cyber charter schools. But what we see here in these bar charts, yellow is for the Tier 1 students, the light blue is for Tier 2 students, and then the darker blue on the end is the Tier 3 students. So when we look at school districts and we look at what proportion of students are Tier 1, we see about 88.9%. Tier 2 students, the ones that have greater need, are 7.8%, and then the remainder are Tier 3 students. When we look at brick and mortar charter schools, we see that they are educating a higher share of students who are Tier 1 students, and a smaller share of Tier 2 and Tier 3 students. And when we look at cyber charter schools, we see that they enroll very, very few students with disabilities who require high cost needs compared to school districts. Like almost 97% of their students are students who have very low cost, very minimal special education needs. And this is the data that the schools themselves report to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So, I think that when we look at this, it is incredibly clear that school districts are educating students who have who require much more money to educate than especially the cyber charter schools. They're not educating their share of students with higher cost needs. And so it's not a surprise that we are sending charter schools far more money in special education funding than they are spending on services for kids. So a 2016 study by the Pennsylvania School Boards Association of charter school enrollment data found that school districts paid charter schools more than $100 million more for special education than charter schools reported spending on special education services for kids. And again, this is what the charter schools themselves are reporting that they are spending. By 2020, 2021, this overpayment of special education had ballooned to $185 million. So in 2020, 2021, school districts paid $185 million in special education funding to charter schools that was not used to provide services to students with disabilities. This is a lot of money. Like, this isn't, we're not talking, coins under the couch cushion here. And so, there is no requirement in the state law for charter schools to return excess special education funding to school districts. In addition, Pennsylvania's charter school law allows charter schools to reallocate special education funding from school districts to pay for anything. So they could pay for advertising contracts, they could pay for CEO salaries, they could pay to these ridiculous, generous fees so that they pay to these for-profit management companies, and they can engage lobbying firms with special education funding. And I think where the rubber really hits the road is when we think about property taxes. So special education funding is something that has been just completely neglected by the state and federal government for a very long time. So this is a chart that is from a report that the Education Law Center did about a year ago, in May of 2022. And when we look at 3 lines, what we see is federal revenue is the yellow line at the bottom. Since from 2008 to 2020, that line has been virtually the same, virtually no increase in funding. State revenue from 2008 to 2020, it has gone up a little bit, and in the past 2 years, it's gone up a little bit more, not much. The blue line are the expenditures for special education that school districts have had to make. So we know that when kids have disabilities, they get an IEP, an individualized education plan, that says this is what this child needs in order to be able to, meet our educational goals. And school districts take in every student who comes through their doors, and school districts meet the needs of their kids. So they can't just say there is no funding, so we're not going to provide the services. They provide the services that students need. So from 2008 to 2020, we have seen almost a $2 billion increase in special education expenditures that school districts have had to shoulder. And when there is no state funding to cover those costs, that funding comes from property tax increases. So when we are talking about special education overpayments that school districts are sending to charter schools, we are talking about property taxes that are being raised to pay for special education services that are then getting sent to charter schools, that are then being wasted by charter schools on things not providing services for students with disabilities. So that $185 million, if that were back in school districts could do a better job providing for kids that they have in their buildings, and they would also have much less pressure every single year to raise their property taxes. And so when we think back to that yellow bar chart, we are seeing, especially with cyber charter schools, enrollment patterns that are consistent with the likelihood that charter schools are gaming the system by cherry picking students, or by telling people that they don't have services to meet their students' needs. And in some cases, they're even discriminating against students with high cost needs. And I would like to just say that while the brick and mortar charter schools overall, their numbers are not super far off from school districts, if you go down a level deeper, you can see that there are many, many, many individual brick and mortar charter schools that serve virtually no students who have high cost needs. And then there are some schools that serve a lot and they do a really good job. So with the brick and mortar charter schools, it is a story of just wildly different student populations in buildings. And that's a little more detailed than we're going to get into right here. But I just think it's worth noting that, school districts have to raise taxes and they have to cut teachers or programs for students in the district schools so that they can send this excess special education funding to charter schools, which charter schools then take $185 million of it and they waste it on stuff other than providing services for students with disabilities. And Lisa Leitner is a parent who has been a warrior for kids with disabilities in Pennsylvania for a very, very long time. And she works with families who have to deal with this charter school system. And, she says charter schools say they welcome in kids with IEPs, but the facts are they welcome only some kids with IEPs. Yet they are funded as if they welcome all of them. And our most vulnerable population, disabled children, are the losers in this unfair game. So, the system really hurts kids who have disabilities that require more services, and it really limits their school choice, which is not the, in the spirit of the charter school law, which was to offer all kids the same opportunities as each other. So what we really need to see the legislature do is more closely match these special education tuition payments to charter schools with their actual costs. So one thing they could do is to apply the special education funding formula to charter schools so that we've got one system of funding special education. It goes across all of our schools. They could also choose to apply it to cyber charter schools because they're the biggest offenders, whatever. But somehow or another, we need to match these payments. It would improve school opportunities for students, for school choice for students with disabilities by substantially reducing the incentive for charter schools to cherry pick some students and exclude others. And by more closely tying the funding to the actual costs, it would save a lot of tax dollars and it would reduce some of the wasteful spending that we're seeing in charter schools. Another thing that they could do is just allow school districts in that calculation for charter school tuition to use the actual percentage of students that are in their district who are receiving services. That would at least equalize tuition between charter and school district students. It would be better than the system that we have right now. And then the General Assembly really needs to enact a law that requires charter schools to return to school districts special education funding that they receive that is not spent to provide students with disabilities with services that they need. So those are some action steps that lawmakers can take, and we are very hopeful that with cyber charters, we're going to see some action on some of this because it's just egregious, and I think we've reached a tipping point in Harrisburg. So now we're going to kind of move on to the second section of this presentation, and it's where we're going to talk about the right to know requests that we filed with cyber charter schools to find out what did they spend on advertising, how much did they spend, and what did they spend it on. And so we found that at least what was reported to us, which is the best that we can ever do, is just you can only ask and then they give you what they give you. We found that cyber charter schools spent $16.8 million on advertising in 2021-2022. We filed a right to know request. We received, actually, I should say, we received and Katya logged more than 2,900 pages of invoices and many other long spreadsheets. There's a lot. We show our work at Education Voters because some of the charter school people like to say that, we don't, but if you want to see any invoice, you want to see anything of this, it is all fully documented and posted in a public Google Drive. And so I will email all of that out to you tomorrow morning. So you can noodle through these invoices on your own. And so what we saw, we received the response to our right to know request from these particular cyber charter schools. We can see that all of them spent substantial funding on advertising. Reach Cyber Charter School is one of those that has a private management company. And so they said they couldn't give us any of their advertising costs because it was behind a management company private contract. And so you do run into that with these private management companies. They're not subjected to the right to know law. And so they can really hide a lot of how they spend their money. Reach Cyber Charter School did give us invoices. They spent $125,000 on gift cards for students. We also asked for gift card purchases. So I'm just going to give you some highlights. So we found that Achievement House Charter School spent $1,306 per student on advertising. So you can just think about, just put that in your head, and if you've got a little calculator, think about your school district, how many students it has, multiply that number by $1,306, and then imagine how much actual money that would be. It is a lot. PA Cyber spent $58,000 on swag, including $9,700 on these little custom owl-shaped erasers, $6,700 on custom lapel pins, $8,600 on branded Post-it notes, and $18,120 on branded magnets. PA Cyber also spent $81,000 on branded clothing and mugs. PA Virtual spent $132,000 on bus wraps and other transit advertising. CCA, Commonwealth Charter Academy, spent $3.4 million on advertising in a 3-month period in 2022. So I just want us to all just take a moment and think about, we're paying property taxes, right? We are writing our checks. We are doing all of that. We are supporting our public schools, and Commonwealth Charter Academy is taking that money and they are spending $1 million a month on advertising. Pennsylvania Virtual Charter School spent $28,000 on sponsorships of minor league baseball teams. As we said, Reach Charter School spent $125,000 on Target gift cards. PA Distance Learning spent $80,000 on an employee who handles advertising. At least that's what it looks like in the little tiny print spreadsheet that they sent us. So can you imagine a school district who had an employee who cost $80,000 a year, and their job was to handle advertising? And Insight Cyber Charter School spent $959,000 on a contract for undisclosed services with a for-profit management company, K-12 Inc. It was a weird invoice where it was like, it looked like monthly payments and everything was redacted except for this one little bit that seemed to be unredacted, maybe by mistake, that said it was $959,000 in 1 month for like these for-profit management services, which you really can't dig into very deep. We also filed a separate right to know request with Commonwealth Charter Academy for invoices for specific parties and events that they had advertised on their public Facebook page. And this was, I have to say, this was something that I had thought we wouldn't even get a response for, because I thought this was already included in the advertising costs, but apparently it is a separate cost center. It is impossible to understand exactly how much money they're wasting, but we'll just go through a few of the things we found from that trove of right to know requests. They spent $86,000 or $8,600 on parties for CCA families at the Ninja Nook, 814 Lanes and Games, and Lehigh Valley Laser Tag. They spent $8,800 on parties for CCA families at Dave & Buster's. They entered into a 3-year sponsorship agreement with the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins. So they're paying $20,000 a year, so $60,000 to sponsor this ice level lounge. And then on top of that, they spent $6,400 on tickets for families to attend games. And then this is really something that's coming up next. In a single year, CCA spent more than $92,000 on catering, concessions, parking, and tickets for CCA students and their families to attend Philadelphia Phillies baseball games. To put it in perspective, $92,000 a year could pay for a teacher or a counselor or a nurse or a librarian. But at CCA, they're choosing to take and not to use that money to hire someone to help their kids. They're choosing to use that money to pay for tickets to professional baseball games for their families. And so, just to go back to this property tax issue, In 2021, 2022, school districts sent nearly $1 billion in tuition payments to cyber charter schools. Because there is no state reimbursement for these costs, charter and cyber charter school tuition payments are funded primarily by property taxes, right? Like, where else do you get the money to pay for them when the state's not giving you a line item to pay for it? And in the Pennsylvania School Board Association 2022 State of Education report, 78% of school districts identified these mandatory charter school tuition payments as one of their biggest sources of budget pressure. It was 33% higher than the next highest rated budget pressure that they have. So really, you know, I was on a school board and we were raising property taxes because every year our charter school tuition would go up, even when you don't have additional students going to charter schools, because if you get additional state funding, then it gets put into the formula, and then, you know, these formulas feed themselves, and so your charter school tuition goes up every year, even if you don't have more kids going to charter schools. And then, like, the absolute bottom line with all of this is that we are overpaying for just a gross failure by most of these schools to provide students with anything that could be considered an acceptable or adequate education. So when we look at graduation rates for charter schools, what we see is that most of them have unacceptably low graduation rates. So you don't want to talk about standardized tests. We can take standardized tests off, you know, let's not even talk about those. Let's talk about why we send our kids to K-12 schools in the first place, which is so they can get a good education, so they can graduate, so they can then go out into the world, get a job, be productive, live a happy, fulfilled life, doing some job that makes them feel satisfied, right? And contribute to our communities. So when we look at graduation rates for all of our schools, that's the bottom line in this chart. It's about, for a four-year graduation rate, it's about 87%. Now, that includes all the charter schools. So if we took out charter schools and we just had school districts, you know, our school district's graduation rate would be higher. But so all of our schools, our overall graduation rate is 87%. Then let's just look at some of these graduation rates. The highest graduation rates are PA Virtual and Reach. They've got an 81, 84%. PA Leadership has 76%. Those three, those are vaguely okay graduation rates, still lower than the state average, but not completely horrendous. Then we go down and we start to see 69, 68%. And then we head into all of these red numbers where we are talking, you know, less than 60%, 50%, in the 40% four-year graduation rates. They don't get much better if we go to the 6-year cohort and the kids get an extra 2 years to try to graduate. These schools are failing kids, and we are spending $1 billion a year for this failure. So, you know, this has short-term implications for our property taxes and very long-term implications for the future of the state when we have, you know, all of these kids who are supposed to be getting an education and supposed to be graduating from high school and entering our communities to be able to, like, work and be productive citizens. And then all these kids aren't getting an education because the schools are failing them. So it is not thorough efficient. So I think you all know we had a school funding lawsuit that went to trial, and in February, the judge declared Pennsylvania's school funding system unconstitutional. It violates the clause in the Constitution that says we need a thorough and efficient system of public education, and it denies students in low-wealth districts the opportunities that they deserve simply because they live in places that can't raise the money that they need. So that is a separate issue. We've got a school funding lawsuit, we've got an unconstitutional system. I would argue that a piece of this unconstitutional system that is not thorough and efficient is that it's not thorough and efficient to have a funding system that starves one sector of schools, which is our school districts, while lavishing these extraordinary excess funding levels that are wasted on another sector of schools, which are cyber charter schools. So it is past time for funding reforms for cyber charter schools. We need to have a flat rate for cyber charter school regular education students of about $9,500 per student. That has been vetted out in all these different ways. That is what it costs to educate a regular education student at home on a computer in other states. it is plenty of money for cyber charter schools, and they do better. They have better results than Pennsylvania, and this is how much they spend. So we need a flat rate for regular education, and then we also need to fix our special education funding so that it is more closely matched with the actual costs. We can do that by either applying the special ed formula to charter schools. We can use the actual percentage of students with disabilities, or we can do both, right? But lawmakers need to do something because this is an unsustainable system. And so I thank you for being here, and I look forward to answering any questions you have. And I'm going to stop recording and